So this week is the Parsha of Chayei Sarah. In it, we learn about the passing of Sarah, the wife of Avram. As the pasuk tells us, she was 127 years old. And upon her passing, Avram, he seeks to find a place, a burial plot for his wife Sarah. Avram chooses a place called Ma'aras HaMachpelah, which is in the city of Hebron. There was a field in it, there was a cave, and he desired that this should be the place for Sarah's burial. The Midrash tells us that Avram selected this place because last week in the Parsha of Vayera, when the angels came to visit Avram and he needed to provide them a meal, so he went and he has the lad fetch the calf for the feast that he is going to serve them. And one of the calves runs away from Avram and he's chasing after it, and it makes its way into a cave. And he looks inside over there and he sees that Avram notices that Adam and Chava are lying there in that cave. There are candles that are kindled, lit around them. And Avram desired, he saw there's something very, very special about this place. And he decided that he wanted his wife, Sarah, she too should be buried with Adam and Chava in that location. So in the beginning of the Parsha of Chayei Sarah, we read about Avram's acquisition of this plot, the Ma'aras HaMachpelah. He approaches the owners of this plot, of this field, and they are the Bnei Ches. And amongst them, it's Ephron, he's negotiating. And initially, he discusses with the Bnei Ches that he has this desire to bury his wife there. And they say, sure, not a problem, we'll give it to you as a gift. But Avram ultimately says he wants to pay for it, and he pays the full amount, the 400 shekel kesef. And this is the place that, as we know it today, the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, where Avram and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, and Yaakov and Leah are buried there. Now, today we're gonna analyze a little bit of this negotiation that took place between Avram and the Bnei Ches, and get a bit of insight into the nature of this acquisition that Avram makes at this point. So, who are these Bnei Ches? Who is Avram negotiating with? So, in the Midrash, it tells us that they were known as the Yevusim. There was a person whose name was Yevus, and he came from the Pelishtim. It wasn't the Jebusites, the Yevusim of the 7 nations that Hashem said that we would conquer. Rather, they were they were descended from Avimelech. And this person, Yevus, was living in this area which we know as today as Yerushalayim, and it was known as Nevus, and therefore this area was called they were called the Yevusim, or they were the Bnei Ches. And the Medrash tells us something very interesting, that in fact, when Avram made this negotiation with the Bnei Ches, he says he wants to purchase the land. They make a counter offer to him. They say, okay, you want to buy this plot of land, this area here in Hebron. We're going to do it on one condition, on the condition that you will not, you or your descendants will not inherit or acquire the land that is Yevus, which is Yerushalayim. And ultimately, the only way they'd be able to acquire this land is with their consent, with the Yevusim's consent. That's the only way we would be able to, Avram's descendants would be able to acquire Yerushalayim. And indeed, Avram made a pact with them, and he made a shavua, he swore, and ultimately it was on that basis of that covenant that he struck with the Bnei Ches that he was able to acquire the Ma'aras HaMachpelah. Now, it's a very, very strange thing because we know that Hashem promised Avram that he will, and his descendants, in fact, will inherit the land of Eretz Yisrael in its entirety. We learned about it in the last week's Parsha, in the previous Parshas in Lech Lecha. He was told by the Bris Bein Absarim that his descendants will inherit the land. And we learned about it. There was various times Hashem made this promise that they will receive the land. So how would Avram now make a promise, an oath with these Bnei Ches that would run contrary to Hashem's assurance and Hashem's promise to us as Avram's descendants that we would receive this land? How would he go tell them and say, we're not going to go take the land without your consent? And now Hashem's promise, Hashem's assurance will be contingent on their goodwill or on them consenting that we should be able to get the land. It's inconceivable. It's hard to understand how Avram would go ahead. Avram, who was a devoted servant of Hashem, and he believed and he trusted in everything that Hashem told him, would go now to the Bnei Ches and promise that he will not attempt to take the land away from him. And certainly Avram must have known how special the land of Yerushalayim was. He brought Yitzchak on the Akedah, which was on Har HaMoriah, Mount Moriah, last week's Parsha in Vayera. So he knew that there was something very unique, and it went all the way back to Adam HaRishon, who was known the special quality of Yerushalayim. And this is not just a pact that happened once between Avram and the Bnei Ches. When we look throughout history, this shavua, this oath and this pact, this covenant, actually hindered the Bnei Yisrael's ability to acquire Yerushalayim. Many years later, we read about how Yehoshua, when he was conquering the land of Eretz Yisrael, when the Jewish people entered the land, he attempted to conquer Yerushalayim, and he was not able to because of this shavua, because of this covenant that Avram made. So hundreds of years later, when the Bnei Yisrael are attempting to acquire Yerushalayim, they were held back because of a covenant, because of a deal that Avram made with these Bnei Ches. In fact, it says, the Medrash, that when the army of Yehoshua reached Yevus, reaches Yerushalayim, so what did the Yevusim do to repel the attack of Yehoshua? They made these idols made out of copper, and on them they put on these copper idols, they put them out in the streets, in the town, in the city square, and they put upon these idols a writing down what the oath that Avram made many hundreds of years earlier. So this was like in their face, showing you guys can't take this because look, you have a standing oath, a standing pact that's in place for many hundreds of years. And indeed, they were not able to conquer the land. So we see that this covenant remained intact and remained in full force at that time. Then the Medrash tells us that subsequently, years later, King David HaMelech, he comes to Yerushalayim and he attempts to conquer it. And again, they reminded him about this shavua, about this oath. But then David HaMelech does something different. He calls all of his men, all of his soldiers, and he tells them, I have a challenge for all of you, that whoever is able to, the first one is going to go and take down all of these idols that have this shavua, that have this pact engraved upon it. Anyone who takes it down, he will be the leader. And Yoav ben Tzruah, one of his generals, he took initiative and he removes all of these salamim, all of these idols. And then David HaMelech proceeds to conquer Yerushalayim. But then it says, what he did was after they took down these idols, David HaMelech then proceeds to buy from the Yevusim. He purchases this city, Yevus, which is Yerushalayim, and he paid full price and was written down, and the deal was completed. So this is very, very bizarre. So what we have here, like this, is years earlier, Avram purchases Ma'aras HaMachpelah contingent on his descendants not attempting to conquer the city of Yerushalayim without their consent. It appears this deal was still in force many, many years later in the time of Yehoshua. And this something about these idols really, really, really repelled and was able to hold off the attack of Yehoshua. They had respect for the deal. When David HaMelech appears, initially they're hesitant to conquer the city, but then he proceeds to remove these idols. And then after he removes the idols, he purchases the city from them. So the question is like this. We have the question we asked before: why would Avram why and how could Avram make such a deal in the first place? It's against Hashem's assurance, Hashem's will. And secondly, in the case of David HaMelech, if this oath and this pact was still in place and still in force after all of these years, and it would seem so because it was in the time of Yehoshua, what would have changed by the time of David HaMelech? What would it help by removing the idols? The idols was just this was a symbolic of the standing covenant that was put in place many, many years earlier. Removing the idols is not going to change anything. If someone were to purchase a property or make a deal and it's written down on the contract, if you rip up the contract, it doesn't change the fact that the person owned the land. The contract is just, now, of course, it has to be registered, and the deed and the title, of course, is the proof. But just by ripping it up in itself doesn't change the facts on the ground that there was a deal, there was a commitment by Avram. So what would it help by removing the idols? And indeed, what was the difference? If you're going to say that something changed, what changed between the time of Yehoshua and when David made his attempt to take the city of Yerushalayim? Why was Yehoshua not able to do it? And why was King David HaMelech able to acquire the city of Yerushalayim? And finally, we see at the end that David decides to, in addition to removing the idols, he intends to purchase the land. Now, if he takes away these idols and he could conquer it with his army, what is the point of actually paying money to purchase the land? We find throughout the time that David HaMelech was king, he fought many, many wars, conquered many, many lands. He didn't purchase them. Yet here, when it comes to Yerushalayim, he decides to purchase the land. So now, this is the backdrop for us to attempt to understand the negotiation that happened between Avram and the Bnei Ches. So this is what we need to understand. What exactly was this negotiation? Avram says, I will pay for, they want to give it to him as a gift. He decides, I want to pay for it. And then there's this whole pact, a whole Shavua covenant that he makes with them. So here, the Rebbe gives us a fascinating insight into the relationship that the Jewish people had to the land of Eretz Yisrael and their ownership of it. And if we understand this relationship that they had to Eretz Yisrael, it can help clarify exactly what Avram did and did not promise to the Bnei Ches. So here, it's important to understand when we talk about ownership, when we talk about acquisition, there are two types of ownership when it comes to land or any property. There is what we will call national ownership, and then there's what we would call private individual ownership. These are two types of ownership that a person may or may not have. National ownership is what we mean is when we talk about a land, a property which belongs to a certain country or government. So generally speaking, when we go and we buy a house, we buy a field, any property that we have, generally speaking, what we're buying is the individual ownership. So maybe it was in the time of monarchy or even today, the land in itself, even if we would say that there is what we call freehold land, at the end of the day, we don't own the land to do as we wish. The land really belongs to the government, to the country, and thus we need to abide by certain rules, and there's certain bylaws, what you can and cannot do on your property. There's taxes that you need to pay. And sometimes there is even, not just in the time of the kings, there are certain laws of eminent domain. The government wants to build a subway or some transit or some other project that they deem to be necessary, and they can appropriate land for various communal greater good need. And in that instance, they would pay the person their fair market value, what their house is worth or not, or whatever the case is, but then they would be able to appropriate the land. Of course, there would be all kinds of lawsuits and there could be all kinds of claims and counterclaims. But the general idea is national ownership is that the land belongs to the governing entity. And that's why a person can't say, well, I bought my house. Why should I'm not going to pay any taxes. I'm not subject to any rules. I could build and do whatever I want on my land. The reality is you are buying the land, but only as an individual. But the land inherently in Canada is something that belongs to this on a greater national level. So there is what we have now these two types of ownership, of course, are not necessarily dependent one on the other. And oftentimes you have one without the other. So that is to say, you have a piece of land that's owned by a person just because, or it's owned by the government. It can be purchased by an individual. Just because something belongs to an individual doesn't preclude that there's another entity that owns it on a national level. So it works both ways. You have sometimes that there are two entities that are related or have ownership on a property on two different levels. So the government, and certainly this was even more so in the times when there was a monarchy where there was even less, people had less rights to their property than people have today. So the king, if they decided they wanted to appropriate the land, they didn't even have to answer to anybody. So you have the national ownership, but you also have individuals who had access to, who had ownership of the land. And conversely, you had in the times when the Jewish people, after the Churban, after the first destruction of the first temple, and the Jewish people went to exile. So the Jewish people lost their national ownership of the land, so to speak, because Yehoshua, he conquered the land, but that effect was nullified by the Galus, and everything, the national ownership was lost to the conquering nation. But Jewish people still had private ownership of their land. And it was only afterwards when Ezra and Nehemiah came back and they reconquered the land that they reestablished the Jewish ownership on a national level. In any case, what we have from the takeaway from this is there are two levels of ownership. And when we talk about Eretz Yisrael as well, there was a promise that we would have the land. Okay, but the question is, what exactly was promised to us? So both aspects are true. There was a promise that we would own the land on a national level. And then there was a promise that we would own the land as well. Each person would have their as a on a national level, that is to say that Eretz Yisrael now is owned by the Jewish people. That is to say, the land has a Jewish character. It's owned by the Jewish nation. But even if we say the land is owned by the Jewish people, that in itself, that ownership itself would not preclude that a non-Jew would be able to own land in the Jewish country. But then there's a second aspect where the Jewish people would own individually, privately. Each person would have their chelik in Eretz Yisrael. As we know, every Jew has there was the 12 Shvatim, that they divided. There was the division of the land in Eretz Yisrael proper and in Transjordan. Each shevet, each tribe had their land, and in turn, each individual had their parcel of land. And that's the general notion when we talk about ownership, is to be mindful of these two types of ownership. Now, at this juncture, there's a debate. Exactly when we talk about when Avram made this negotiation, it's a little bit beyond the purview of this discussion. What exactly if the Jewish people actually owned the land or not? There's a big debate. When Hashem promised Avram at the Bris Bein Absarim, so we know the Bris Bein Absarim, Avram was 70 years old, and then Hashem promised. Hashem promised that He said to your children, I will give the land. According to the Midrash, once Hashem says that I'm going to give you the land, that itself it's as if they already got it at that time. Some say that was more of a promise and was something that would come to fruition many, many years later. It's an interesting discussion. Now, perhaps on another week we could talk about the different stages of the ownership of the land and how holy, if it was actually a holy land at that point. But certainly, when Avram is negotiating with the Bnei Ches, the question is, even if we say they own the land, parts of Eretz Yisrael, which part did they, even if we'll say that they wanted to acquire a land, rather, when he's trying to acquire the Maras Machpelah, is he trying to acquire it as an individual or as a collective? And this is the key. At this point, Avram, at least according to the simple understanding, there was no national ownership of Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't owned. At that point, it was called Eretz Canaan. It was the national ownership was not Jewish. So when Avram, in fact, approaches the Bnei Ches and he wants to buy this land, he was not attempting to buy the land in terms of acquiring it on the national level. What he's trying to do is he wants to acquire it as an individual. Avram did not deem that at this point it was the time, with Hashem's assurance and his promise that we will inherit the land. It was not the time yet to acquire it on a national level. So therefore, what is he trying to acquire? A burial plot for his wife as a private citizen, as a private individual. And therefore, he attempts to buy a piece of land privately, a private individual ownership. And this is his negotiation with the Bnei Ches. And in fact, we see in Avram's in his negotiation in this parsha Chayei Sarah, it's Perek Chav Gimel, Pasuk Daled. So he approaches the Bnei Ches and he says like this. This is Pasuk Daled. Ger v'soshav anochi imachem. Avram tells the people of Ches, I am a ger and a toshav. A ger means an alien, an immigrant. Toshav is a resident. He says, give me the land. I am a foreigner and I am a resident. It seems to be a contradiction. Are you a resident or are you alien? Are you a foreigner? Which one is it? So Rashi explains that this was his negotiation. He says like this. Which one do you want? If you wish to sell it to me like an immigrant, if I don't belong, then I will purchase it I don't live here. I will now pay whatever the fair market value is for this place. But if you're not going to sell it to me, So then I will be like a resident, which means this is mine and I will take it by force. It's an interesting negotiating tactic on Avram's part. He's telling them either I will buy it and I'm a foreign alien, or I will take it by force. So what's Avram really saying here? If you say that, now if we understand this negotiation through the prism of the two types of ownership, what could we see here? If Avram is an alien, he's essentially saying this is not truly my land. This is not a Jewish, on a national level, this is not a Jewish land. So I'm really an alien. I'm a foreigner. I'm an immigrant. So therefore, how am I going to acquire the land? I'll have to pay for it. I'll buy it off you. And now I'll own it on an individual level. So Avram says, if you're willing to sell it to me as an individual ownership, then it's fine. But if not, if you're not willing to sell, then I am a resident. What does a resident mean? I come to realization that you're not willing to give me this land as a private citizen. I understand now that Hashem's assurance, Hashem's promise that I will inherit the land, now is the time. And therefore, I will take over this, I will acquire this land on a national level. So Avram was really trying to acquire this individually. It was only if he had no choice, he would realize it's a sign from Hashem that the time has come to take the land and give it a Jewish character, he would proceed on that path. So therefore, now, based on this understanding, where Avram is coming from, his negotiation and his deal with the Bnei Ches now makes a lot more sense. What did the Bnei Ches tell him? So in other words, Avram is, so the context is the national ownership belonged to the Yevusim, to the Bnei Ches. Avram is merely trying to let the Yevusim keep the national ownership, but he wants to individually own the land. So what do the Yevusim tell him? Okay, this is the deal. We are willing to allow you to buy this land as an individual on the condition that years from now, there's going to come a time that you're going to try to allow us, try to acquire this land on a national level to make it a Jewish land. But when you do that, allow us to live and continue to be there as individuals. We want to maintain our private ownership. And in other words, now this deal makes a lot more sense. What Avram is trying to do now is buy it as an individual, and they'll keep it as the national ownership. And years later, when it comes time for the Jewish people to acquire it nationally, the Bnei Ches will retain their private ownership. So now you can understand that this deal does not contravene Hashem's assurance. Hashem told Avram that your children will inherit the land. That means it will become a Jewish land. But as we said before, that does not in any way conflict with the ability, just because the Jewish people own the land nationally, it's not in conflict with a non-Jew owning the land privately. In fact, we know that throughout history, there were times that there were non-Jews that lived in Eretz Yisrael. And the Rambam actually tells us that when Yehoshua when he attempted to conquer the land, he would send out three messengers. One message would be that whoever wants to run away and flee, escape, should do that right now. When he was approaching a city that he wanted to conquer, the first message was whoever wants to run away should run away. Message number two was whoever wants to make peace, let them make peace. And his third message was whoever wants to fight, get ready to fight. In other words, if someone wanted to make peace, they had to reconcile themselves to live as with the 7 Noahide laws. They had to get rid of their idols, but then the non-Jew could live and maintain ownership in the land of Eretz Yisrael, because on a national level it belongs to the Jews, but he has his land there privately. So that's what Avram is trying to do. Avram is saying, I'm not trying to acquire this nationally now. I just want it as an individual. And in return, in many years from now, there will be a time at some point in history, we will acquire the land and it'll become a Jewish land. And our deal is we're not going to drive you out as long as you follow the rules. So like this, Avram's negotiation does not in any way run contrary to Hashem's promise. Yes, Hashem will give the land to all of the Bnei Yisrael. It will be a Jewish land. But at the end of the day, individual non-Jews could live and coexist in harmony and in peace alongside the Jewish people. But this is what happened. Many years later, when Yoshua attempted to acquire the land, at that point, it was not the time for Yerushalayim to become the capital city. It would only happen many years later in the time of David HaMelech. So what Yoshua was trying to do was to acquire the land as an individual, not on the national level. And at that time, he wasn't able to do it because the Shavua, this covenant, remained intact. It still remained that we promised that we will not take it from them as individuals. They put out the idols to remind Yoshua about his promise. But years later, when David HaMelech approaches the city of Yerushalayim, he's not coming to acquire it as an individual. He's here to transform Yerushalayim to become the eternal capital city of the Jewish people. Because that was the time. Hashem told him now is the time. But what did the Yevusim do? They reneged on their promise. They put out their slumim, they put out their idols and said, hey, Avram made a promise that you're not going to take it away from us. But what they did was they abrogated their promise because the promise was not about the national ownership. Avram would never say that he's not going to take away the land and make it a Jewish capital. That was already promised from Hashem, and he would never make such a deal with them. His promise was that as private citizens, as individuals, they can maintain their ownership on the land. But once the Bnei Ches began to go against their promise, and they started to stonewall, and they started to not allow David HaMelech to maintain control and national ownership of Yerushalayim. So now he came to the realization that the whole promise is off. So that's why he took away those idols, because the idols, which had the Shavua, because the Shavua was no longer standing. The promise was about individual ownership, and now they changed the terms. And they said, you can't take the land at all from us. Once David HaMelech realized that they were not keeping by their promise, they removed the idols. They realized that the covenant has now been breached. It is now voided. But still, David HaMelech wanted to pay for the land. He still decided, even after he was able to conquer the land on a national level, he still decided to pay for it. Why? Because his acquisition was only nationally, that on the general level, it was a Jewish city. But now David HaMelech wanted that even individually, Yerushalayim should be ours. Therefore, he paid for it. He paid for the full amount. So now he completely severed any connection that the Yevusim had to Yerushalayim. And indeed, the Midrash tells us that there are three places that if anybody will come and say historically who has the claim to Eretz Yisrael or not, it's subject to many, many disputes. But there are three places, the Midrash says, that are incontestable, that they clearly and absolutely categorically belong to the Jewish people, because we find that our ancestors paid. They didn't just conquer, they actually paid for the land. And that is, number one, in this week's Parsha, Avram paid for Ma'aras HaMachpelah. He didn't receive it as a gift. He decided to pay for it. Because when you receive a gift, there's still a relationship. I gifted it to you. And therefore, there's some relationship of the gifter to the recipient. Avram paid for the Ma'aras HaMachpelah. And therefore, there should be no relationship of Ephron and the Hittites to Ma'aras HaMachpelah. Then there is, as we just learned about, David HaMelech, who paid for the land of Yerushalayim, in addition to conquering it. And finally, learn in the Parsha of Vayishlach how Yaakov pays for Shechem, which would later be the place where Yosef is buried and many other special events that took over there. So the Midrash says these are the three places that no nation in the world could come in with a claim and say it belongs to them, which is, this Midrash is quite ironic because some of the most hotly contested and most controversial places today, when we talk about Hebron and the Maras Machpelah, Yerushalayim and Shechem and in that area of Yehuda and Shomron, are the most disputed, at least from the nation of the world perspective, which we know beyond a question of a doubt, all of Eretz Yisrael belongs to us. And how much more so these places which weren't just conquered and we lived there, but we actually paid top full dollar for their acquisition. So based on this, we now are able to explain why Avram made the promise with the Bnei Ches. Of course, everything he did was 100% in compliance with Hashem's promise. And ultimately, when the nations, when the Yevusim, they breached the contract, when they went against the terms, so then David HaMelech has now acquired Yerushalayim on all levels. On a national level, it became essentially a Jewish capital for eternity in Yerushalayim, and even on an individual level, it would belong to the Jewish people forever. So, number one, we see we see from all of this that how these places are, how important they are to Jewish history. How even when these lands that were purchased, the Maras Machpelah was purchased by Avram, was something that was uniquely Jewish because he bought it as an individual. Now, Avram had two components to him. On the one hand, he was a father to the entire Jewish community. He was the forefather, the first of the three avos for all of Klal Yisrael. So everything Avram does has national impact. But then he's called Avram Avinu. He is the father of every single one of us. So the actions that he does has an individual relevance and resonance for each and every one of us. But since Avram bought the property as an individual, the inheritance of it would only go to Yitzchak, but not to Yishmael, because Yishmael was not an heir to Avram. As we learned in the previous parshas, Ki bi Yitzchak yikarel Chazar, your Yitzchak will be the one who would inherit. So certainly the other nations of the world cannot claim that they inherited the land. But on a more general perspective, when we go back to we spoke about the negotiation of Avram, the way he approaches them, he says an interesting thing. He says, Ger v'toshav anochi, I am an immigrant and I am a resident. So we explained on a practical level what the posturing was about. But there's also a spiritual lesson that we can take from Avram, this idea of being an immigrant and being a resident. And that is because when we think about our lives and the communities and the environment and the lands that we live in, are we to see ourselves as immigrants or are we to see ourselves as residents? Because we think about our identity, right? And we are in a land here in Canada, which is a great country. But the question is, are we to see ourselves? Of course, we are residents, we are citizens over here, but in terms of our identity, do we see ourselves as residents or do we see ourselves as immigrants? Because throughout history, there's always been two approaches when contending with living in exile, living in foreign lands. Some say in order to survive, in order to be able to keep going, we need to be residents. That is to say, we should assimilate, we should surrender our identity and become like the hosting nation that we're in? Or do we retreat and we become like foreigners? We're in a land, and if you look at the land that you're living in, it's impossible to really be there and maintain your integrity, to maintain your identity. And therefore, we put up these walls, we surround ourselves with these barriers, and we are just truly foreigners in this land. So what is the true approach? Are we to be residents? Are we to be immigrants? And the answer is perhaps there's a third way. It's not an either or. It's not either you assimilate or you retreat. Because ultimately, each and every one of us were sent on a mission here into this world, not to escape, to flee, but rather to embrace the world, but not to let ourselves get bogged down, but rather to elevate, to transform. Everything we do in this world is with physical items, is to be able to engage with the material and the physical, to introduce holiness, to introduce light into everything that we do. But so on the one hand, we need to fully embrace, we are like residents. We have to work, go to work. We have to engage with the environment that we're in. We can't ignore it. We can't be oblivious to it. So there is an element that we are residents. But on the other hand, we have to also remember that we are foreigners. This is not truly our place. That is to say, the true calling and our true place where we belong is not here in this Gullus. It's in Yerushalayim, it's in Eretz Yisrael. On a more broader level, this physical world itself, we are but merely travelers. We are passing by it. As we mentioned the story before about the Maggid of Mizrich, who was very, very much impoverished, and his home was very, very sparsely furnished. Once he was visited by one of his students, they go in there and they see there's barely a table and a chair to sit on. And this is the holy great Maggid of Mizrich. They said, Rebbe, how could you live in such abject poverty? And they said, where's all your furniture? Where's your couches? Where's your anything? We don't see anything here. Where's the chandeliers? And the Rebbe tells them, I don't understand. I'm looking at you. I see with you, you're just wearing your clothes and your coat. Where's your furniture? Where's your couch? And they said, Rebbe, don't you understand? We're on the journey. We packed a little suitcase, but I'm not going to schlep my couch with me wherever I go. And the Rebbe said, aha, on a journey, when we're on the way, that is different. Indeed, that is true. Each and every one of us here in this world, we're just going through a journey. We're just passing by. And therefore, we have to remember that when you're on a journey, you don't have to schlep and pack all of your suitcases and schlep all your furniture with you. But rather, you have to remember you're on the way. So even if you don't have all your comforts and you don't have everything with you, you remember that this is just, you're passing through. Eventually, you'll get to the destination where your home truly is. And therefore, in this world, each and every one of us, we have to remember that it's all temporary. And our challenge and our mission is to take all that is temporary and all that is fleeting, and we take those opportunities to do the mitzvahs, to transform every encounter, every opportunity we have, being both the resident but also being the immigrant, to take that opportunity to make it a dwelling place for Hashem. May we merit that this journey, this voyage that we're on, should bring us to our ultimate destination, the permanent destination, Yerushalayim Yir HaKodesh, with the building of the Beis HaMikdash Hashlishi in here of Yameinu Amen.